Hey, my name is Derek Peterson, and this is Pitch Deck 101. It's a quick walkthrough of what is a pitch deck, how do you use it, and what is it used for. So we're going to walk you through some of the basics, starting with an overview, and then we're actually going to get into each slide of the deck to kind of teach and educate you on how and why you should be pitching. So we'll go ahead and jump right in. Let's start with what is a pitch deck. So a pitch deck is typically a 10 to 12 slide presentation, and it has a very specific purpose. It's to generate interest. And so we want people interested, we want them engaged. And so usually there's two types of audiences that we're trying to engage. The first is investors. Obviously, if you're creating a pitch deck, one of the biggest reasons is you might want to raise capital, and so you're pitching to investors. But one of the lesser thought of things is that you might want to look for talent. So maybe you're trying to recruit a business partner or some sort of resource, and you may want to use this pitch to kind of show them, hey, we've got our ducks in a row, you should join our team. And so, in this pitch, we'll mostly talk about investors, but there's definitely several reasons why you may want to use this deck. So let's talk about the main goal of the pitch deck. So establishing a foundation of trust is why we're doing this. And so you pitch, it's a good introduction, but you want to start building that trust from day one because that's what's going to get people to join your team. That's what's going to get investors to write you those checks. And so there's a couple things that you need to do to establish trust. The first being you have to know what information to cover. If you're covering the right information, you're going to look more prepared, and investors are going to be more interested because they know that you kind of know what makes a good business and what are some of the key metrics and variables that you need to define. The second thing is you've got to show passion for the problem. So nobody wants an entrepreneur that's kind of lukewarm, like when the going gets tough, they're going to quit. They want an entrepreneur that's passionate, and not just passionate for their solution, but passionate for the problem. They really want someone who, is going to pivot 2 or 3 times if absolutely needed after they raise capital to find the solution for the problem so that investor's money doesn't disappear. So they want to find someone that's passionate. The next is you have to show that you have the right team to pull it off. Do you have someone with experience with sales? Do you have a good set of advisors? The better your team is, the better your chances of success. There's a saying out there, we back the jockey, not the horse, meaning that if you have a great team, you can pivot your idea 3 or 4 times and still be very successful. If you have the best idea in the world, but you don't have a great team, probably not going to work out. Then you really need to show that you understand the market. And so have you done your research? Do you really understand your customers? Do you have personas created? Things like that are going to give investors confidence that you really know the market or you've done the research. Maybe you worked in the industry for 10 years. Maybe you didn't, but you're able to piece together a few things that, anecdotally that somebody else knows that are kind of showing that you have a different view on the problem. Either way, you really have to show that you understand the market. And next is you have to show that your idea is tested and proven. We really see this a lot is that if you don't show that you have traction, whether that's paying customers or pre-orders or something to that extent, it's going to be really hard to fund your business. A great idea that's it, just a great idea. And so you really have to show that you've kind of tested and proven that the market really wants what you have. If an investor writes you a check, they want to get a 10x return. That's their goal. If you can't sell to everybody and they all want your product, maybe not everybody in every market, but if you can't sell everyone that you're targeting, then they probably don't want to invest. And then the last thing is you need to be able to stitch it all together and tell a great story. So as you're going through this deck, you're looking at all of the slides and saying, hey, this is a great, compelling story. All this stuff is adding together to kind of create this narrative that, hey, they really can actually pull this off. They really have done their homework. It's all about a great story. If you have the information, but you can't tell a compelling story, it just means it makes it a lot harder for investors to buy into what you're trying to do. At the end of the day, this is to start conversations, so you need to tell a great story. Okay, trust isn't superficial. So here's what I mean by that. I want you to ask yourself 2 important questions when you think about trust. The last slide, we talked about the different things you do to gain trust. This is why that's so important. Here are the 2 questions that you really need to think about as you're building your pitch deck to make sure that you maximize that level of trust. First one is, what would you have to do to prove to someone that they should give you $1 million? You may not raise $1 million in your first round of funding, but typically, entrepreneurs are going to raise several funds as they continue to build their company. And so if you're going to get several checks that add up to $1 million, how do you justify that? I mean, if you had $1 million of your own life savings, what would somebody else have to do to convince you to give them that money on the chance that there's a return? So it's a little bit of a risky business, but you got to think about that when you're putting together your pitch, because that's what's happening. That's the type of trust you need to build with this pitch. So before you go off and hack this together without taking it seriously, you've really got to think about that. And the second thing is, if you're trying to pitch someone, a team member, a resource, a partner to work with you, what's it going to take for them to quit their job that maybe has good benefits and good pay and come work for your startup that maybe has bad pay and no benefits, right? And so you got to sell them on the vision. You've really got to convince them that, hey, this is really something that you need to come and do. So this is really what we're talking about with trust, very deep-seated trust every step of the way. Okay, so let's cover a few misconceptions, and then we'll get into the meat of this. So one is investors will give you a check if your pitch is great. So the pitch is the beginning. Again, this is to generate conversations. It's to get investors to want to talk with you. There'll be plenty of diligence, they call it, that they do it after this phase to determine whether or not you should get that capital. This is really just the first step. The second is your idea is obvious and investors will easily understand it. Huge misconception. If investors don't know your market, if they haven't really done research, if this is the first time they've heard your pitch, you can't expect them to just get it. You've got to do a very, very good job of breaking it down to help them understand, hey, this problem that you're showing them, why is that really a problem? What is the evidence for that? They may not know that. So a problem you think is obvious may not be as obvious to them. I have no competition. This is everyone's biggest pet peeve. Everyone has competition, even if your competition is just inertia, getting people to change. You all have competition. There's no such thing as no competition. Throwing that one in there as a bonus, just never ever say that. And last but not least, I know my stuff, and so I don't have to prepare. You really, really, really need to practice this 10, 20, 100 times to make sure that when you get up there and you have your chance to pitch, it is as seamless as it could possibly be. There's really nothing worse than seeing like a great idea that's pitched super poorly. Because as an investor, I'm thinking, man, they have this great idea, but like their pitch is just not up to par with what I'm expecting. Is this team really going to prepare and do the work it takes and execute well enough? It comes down to execution. Even if this is a great idea, I don't really know, and the team is really important. So you've really got to practice your pitch. You've got to figure out what you're going to say, how you're going to say it, run through it 100 times, memorize it so you don't have to look at notes, and then be able to do it within the allotted time. So these are just a few misconceptions about, I think, pitching that I've seen, and so I wanted to throw those out really quick. All right. Let's talk about pitch deck variations. There's different types of pitching, and so these pitch deck variations we'll cover very quickly. The first one is like the 3 to 5 minute deck. Okay, so these are all gonna have the same components, but the 3 to 5 minute deck, you only can hit on the big stuff and hit on it really, really quickly. This is a very hard presentation to do because you know so much about your business and you're very passionate, but you've got to give the investors just enough interest to get them to want to come talk with you. You don't have a lot of time to talk about specifics or how you've implemented your app or what your infrastructure in the background looks like. Nobody cares at this point. You just need to get some few quick hits in that we'll show you a little bit later. Then you get kind of the 10-minute plus deck. Maybe the one where you have a captive audience of investors, if you're looking at LPs or something, and they want to get enough information to see if this is worth doing diligence on. And so you have a little bit more time. You can get a little bit more involved in the business. And so that's kind of the 10-minute deck. And then you've got like what's called a read-ahead deck in some ways. And so this is going to contain much more written detail. And so this is something you email either before or after the actual pitch that an investor may read through on their own time. So obviously you're not there to pitch it. It can't just have a slide with a picture on it. You've got to put in, into text some of the things that you're going to say. And so there's different variations of this deck that I'm going to show you, but they all contain the same components. And that's what we're going to go over today. Okay. Before we dive into each slide, let's just look at an overview of the basic structure of a pitch deck. We won't talk about all of these now, but it's some of the typical stuff that you really want to know when someone's explaining an idea to you. Okay, so like, what is the problem? How are you solving it? How are you going to charge? Who else is already doing it? What's your growth potential? How are you progressing? Who's on your team? Things like that. So we're going to actually use in this presentation the 500 startups pitch deck, the template that they give. It's a great little pitch deck that covers all of the keys. And so we're going to actually walk through that template slide by slide. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into slide 1, the introduction and logo slide. All right, this slide, pretty straightforward. Basically, your logo, a tagline, maybe what your secret sauce is, some quick statement that, is kind of meant to impress. Okay, then we're going to get to the second slide. This is where we get to the good stuff here. First slide's easy. Second slide is we have to talk about the problem. Now, there's a couple things here you need to know. One is visuals are great here. Don't just describe the problem in a paragraph if you can help it. Show them visuals or diagrams, anything that's going to help a lay person really understand what the problem is that you're facing. And not only that, but make sure when you talk about the slide, you're really convincing everyone of why this is a problem. The worst thing that you can do here is say, hey, the problem in the world is that everybody doesn't have apple pie after dinner every night. And in my head, I'm thinking, man, I don't really know if that's a problem. I mean, does everyone really need that every night? And so you better really have some evidence to back up like why everyone's missing apple pie for dinner after dinner every night. Because if you can't justify the why behind the problem, any investor that doesn't really, really specifically understand your market, you're going to lose them right here because they're going to be thinking the whole time, they're trying to solve this problem that I don't really think is a problem. And so it's kind of dead in the water right there. They're not even going to believe your product market fit sometimes. If you can explain it well. That's kind of the problem slide. Next, we're going to go to the solution. So this is kind of where you follow up the problem. You say, hey, here's the problem. Not everyone has apple pies for dinner or after dinner. Terrible example, I know. But then you're going to offer up the solution and say, so we've got an automatic pie delivering machine where you text to a number and it comes and delivers pies. And so you're going to talk about what your solution is to that potential problem. And sometimes you may talk about how it works here. You may do that in a different slide. But you're going to cover really just in simple terms how you're solving that problem, kind of your solution. There could be many solutions of the problem. How are you specifically doing it? Then we're going to get to traction. So traction is the slide where you're kind of putting your money where your mouth is. Traction may be the number of users you have. It may be your recurring revenue growth. It may be the number of subscriptions, whatever that is. This is where you're going to show it. And so this is really important. If you don't have any traction, investors are going to really wonder like, hey, is this just an idea? Ideas are worth nothing. So the traction is really where you show if the idea is really any good. And so whatever that traction is, you have to make that really compelling. So if you go out and say, hey, the market has 50,000 people in it, that are business customers, and I've already got 400 that have basically indicated that they're ready to buy from me because this is such a big problem. And, 100 of those people have already sent me a check to be the first ones in line. Okay, that's traction. Maybe you don't have any revenue yet, but hey, you have a lot of people very, very interested. And so that's really a big thing they're going to look for is, do you have any traction? Everybody has ideas. Everyone has lots of ideas. The traction is what separates the good ideas from everything else. Next, we're going to get into how it works. This is, again, preferably a visual, a quick breakdown of like how your solution works. So if you have a web app that helps people grocery shop quicker, this might be, hey, they download the app shows them how to grocery shop better, and they save a bunch of time and they don't have to check out. And so kind of a very basic display of how the app works, maybe if it's an app or if it's a service, how it kind of works. Again, diagrams are great. This is going to go in a little bit more detail than the solution might go into. Sometimes these slides are combined, but either way, this is a great way to kind of showcase, a little bit more detail of how it works. But again, you've got a very short period of time. And so if you're doing a 3 to 5 minute pitch, you can't spend much time here. Don't talk about advanced algorithms. Give us just the detailed surface level here on how it works. Slide number 6, business model and finances. This is really, you're going to do a couple things here. One is you're going to describe how you're going to make money. So how do you charge for customers? Is it a monthly fee? Is it a one-time fee? Is it a percent for every transaction they do? What and how are you charging your customers? And then you also have to talk about how do you think your customers are going to respond to the pricing? How this might sustain a profitable business. You might even get into some historical numbers as far as finances, different things like that to kind of show how your business model is going to make money. And then don't forget the expense side of it too. So if you come out and say, hey, I'm going to make 1% on every transaction, and that's going to be $4 million a year, if your business has a manual component and you need 10,000 people in the workforce, you better be able to prove in the business model that not only can you generate that revenue, but it's going to be profitable on the other side as well. Slide 7, we're going to get into competition or how you're different. I love this little graph. Typically to make this super simple, you pick kind of 2 metrics that you're better at than your competitors. So it could be price and usability. And then you chart those on these 2 axes and you throw all your competitors up there. And then based on where your competitors fall, it shows that you're better. This is great because if you can't fill this out and kind of show that you're considerably better than your competitors in a couple of different ways, then you got to really ask yourself the question, hey, maybe this idea really isn't that great. But what you're really trying to show here is you're trying to show why you're different from everybody else in the market. So if there's 100 competitors already doing this, or even if there's 5 already doing this, why would the market want just one more competitor in a sea of competitors? How are you different? How is that going to make a difference? This is where you're going to show that. Next, we're going to look at market opportunity. So this is where you're really going to want to kind of break down the market as you see it. And so the market is essentially who's going to be purchasing your product. So there might be a large market and you might be selling to a subset initially in a smaller market. Typically as investors, we want to see like an entry market, like who are you going to sell to first? Who's going to be the beachhead? And then we want to see, okay, but then, a year into this, what's the real big market that we can tap into, with a couple of tweaks or changes here or there. So we want to see the total addressable market in this area. And we want to see that in users and generally dollars as well. So you kind of got to equate this to money at the end of the day, but starting with users is perfectly fine. And just be prepared to defend your analysis on this. So don't Google a couple things and throw them in. And the second an investor asks you a question about, hey, how big is your market? Or you say there's 30 billion people on the planet. Geez, I thought there was only 10 billion. Be able to back that up with some real data, have your research, have the sources for that, and memorize it so you can answer questions on the fly if you need to about how the big your market really is. All right, slide 9, progress, timeline, growth strategy. So what this is trying to illustrate is this is trying to put some of those things we've talked about into a timeline that will help you to tell your story. We talked about earlier how important your story really is. This timeline is going to make it easy for the investor to see that. So the timeline may look something like this. Hey, we started in the R&D phase. We got our first customer. We raised our first round of funding. Now we're at 50,000 customers. We've got a bunch of pre-orders. And with our funding, this is where we're going to be in 2 or 3 years. And so this is really what tells me the story of what have you accomplished so far and what do you think you're going to accomplish in the future by raising this capital. That's super compelling because if I have trouble putting the whole story together, I'm going to get really skeptical really quick on, what you're doing and how you're doing it well. So this is a great place for you to showcase what you've accomplished in the past and then help to convince me that you can continue on that trajectory and do that again in the future. All right, last and definitely not least, probably most, is the team. So this is the slide where you've really got to talk about your team and why they're important and really why this is the best team to tackle the job. So for instance, if you have a great idea, why should I let your team work on that instead of taking that idea and giving it to another team that's more capable to work on it? Think of it that way. So while you're building your team and prepping for this, think about, okay, who really knows about this industry? Who might I really need to make this happen? Those are the people you're going to want on your team. You can put advisors in here. Those are really great, especially if you have some big name advisors that have done this before or are part of other larger companies. But at the end of the day, most of us know that advisors, while they're going to help out and create connections, they're not going to control all the execution. It's really the team that does that. So make sure you have a good team. You might love your college buddies and they may be great friends, but really think like, are those the best people to get you where you want to go? I mean, maybe they are, but maybe they're not. And so this is where you're going to prove to us that you have the best team. And so, make sure that you've thought a lot about this. So when they look at it, they're like, who are these people and, why can they do the best job? Okay, so that's pretty much it. I know we went through that really fast. Last statement, pitching is an art and a science. We know what investors are expecting. We know what slides they're going to want to see, but it's still very much an art form and showmanship. And so can you pull it off? Can you do it? Absolutely, especially with watching this deck. So go through this presentation again, pause it in the video, slide by slide, take a closer look at it, construct a demo of this or just a proof of concept, and then start to work it, have other people review it. This isn't something you should be keeping a secret. You should be sharing this, pitching to everybody you can find that, that knows what they're doing, that can give you some good feedback. But this should definitely get you started.